Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In the previous class, we have seen what are the different components are available in the Terraform. So now we need to aware of what is the usage of each components and where we can use, how to use, what is the use of that component, what is the syntax of that component. So if you know all those details, then we can able to create the resources from any cloud easily. If we cannot come to know what is the usage of each component, what is the syntax and where we can use, how to use, we cannot able to create the resources easily. So that is where, so in this tutorial, we are going to see the first component, which is called provider. Okay, so we will see what are the providers in the Terraform, why the providers are needed, and then we will focus more on how to configure and how to use those providers. Okay, so in the Terraform, provider is the component. Okay, the name suggests it provides a service or platform. Okay, so or if you can see that other difference, Terraform provider is a plugin that acts as an interface between the Terraform and external services. External services in the sense it's a cloud services. Okay, so the Terraform depends or relies on multiple plugins. They are called providers. The Terraform uses the providers to connect or interact with the cloud platforms. Then it will provisioning the resources. So cloud platforms like such as AWS, Azure, GCP, DigitalOcean, and so on. Let's take example. If you're provisioning the AWS infrastructure or resources, we need provider to interact or connect with the respective AWS infrastructure, and then we can create the resources which is needed. Okay, so typically provider is a interaction component between the Terraform and respective infrastructure platform. Okay, so that is where, so these platforms or infrastructures, it may be cloud platforms, it may be VMware, or it may be OpenStack, DNS providers, example Route 53, database providers, example PostgreSQL, MySQL, digital versions or GCP. So these all are the infrastructure platforms. Okay. So Terraform itself contains the default plugins. They are called providers. When we execute the Terraform code, a respective provider will interact and create the resources accordingly. Okay. Example, if we need that DNS resource or database resource, so the Terraform itself has the default plugins are available. Example, if you want to create that DNS, if you want to create the cluster, if you want to create any database. Okay, so the Terraform itself, if you can define that provider, automatically the Terraform will be connected to that respective cluster and it will create the cluster. Say example, I want to create that Azure cloud. Okay, so from Azure cloud, I want to create that AKS cluster. So if you can define that provider as a Azure, so if you can try to define that resource provider block and resource block, in that resource block, we need to define all the resources which is needed for creating the Kubernetes cluster from the Azure. So from there, if we can try to execute the Terraform code, what will happen? So the Terraform provider, it will connect to that respective resources from the Azure, it will create it. Okay, so that is how. So the HashiCorp company developed that multiple providers in the Terraform. So okay, so the main key features of that providers are, so using those providers we can manage that resources actually. Okay, so providers are used to define that resource, so which is called resource block. Example, if you want to create that EC2 instance, if you want to create the virtual machines, if you want to create the networks, database, Kubernetes cluster, ECS cluster, registry, whatever it may be. So all those we can call it as a resources. So if you want to create and manage those resources using Terraform providers, we can able to create and we can able to manage it. And the second thing is, if you want to create those resources, first we need to connect to the cloud. If you want to connect to the cloud, we need some authentication mechanism. So those authentication, we can call it as a access keys and secret keys. So that is where, so one of the major feature of that provider is it will be handle that authentication with the infrastructure or services. So make sure ensure the secure access. Okay, so that is where the second feature is authentication. The third feature is API interaction. So if you want to provisioning that resource, okay, we need to create the Terraform code, okay, or we need to configuring the Terraform. So that is where using providers translate Terraform configurations into the API calls to the our target infrastructure or services. So the third feature is API interaction. Okay, so this is how the features will be useful in the clouds or Terraform. And the next thing is we have the Terraform provider. So the first thing is how to use the Terraform provider. The first we need to declare the provider. So which is called provider block. How we can declare that provider? What is the syntax? How we can define? So that means we have to specify the provider in your Terraform configuration file. If you want to create resources, you need to create Terraform configuration file as a resource block. So at the same way, first, if you want to create the resources, from where you need to create, Terraform provider will tell. So in the provider block, if you define AWS, that will connect to that AWS cloud, then it will create your resources. Okay. So then the second one is we have to configure the provider. That means we have to provide the necessary information like credentials and required information for the provider, like some settings information, some resource information we need to provide. Okay, let's say take example. Here are the two examples I have defined. One is for configuring the provider block, and second one is for resource block. Okay, so in this we are configuring the AWS provider. So provider I have seen see here AWS I have given. So that means it will connect to the AWS using this provider plugin. So and region we have given where we need to connect it, US East or US West, whatever it may be. And the second thing I told right in the feature, so we need to access key and secret key to authenticate that AWS resources. If you mention Azure, so using these access methods, it will able to connect it. So this is how we can define the provider block. This is a simple syntax actually. So going forward, once we have seen all these components, while creating time, we can play with that different syntaxes actually, different examples. Okay, so this is how we can call it as a provider or provider block, we can say. And if you can see that this is called create EC2 instance. EC2 instance is the resource. If you want to create that any resource from the cloud, we need to define the resource block. See here resource AWS instance, the instance name is a test. So in that AWS, I'm using that what we need to create that instance. Some configurations are needed. So those configurations we can call it as the AMI. What is the AMI? What is the instance type? What is the VPC? What is the subnet? There are different configurations. So the block should be like this. So you need to be aware of this actually. Okay. So this is how the provider will be useful. Okay. What is the provider? Why we need to use the provider, and how to create the provider block with the syntax, and how to define or how to configure the resource block also. Okay, so that's it friends. Could you please go through this? If any doubts, could you please comment in my channel? So in the next class we can see that one more component which is called resource block. So like this we can complete all those components, then finally we can go ahead and execute the create resources from the cloud platform. Okay, thanks for watching. Please do subscribe, don't forget.